Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, a podcast where we utterly creep you out in as many ways as possible, and we also happen to discuss some fascinating texts of science fiction. And we are going to be revisiting Istvan Csicsery-Ronay's The Seven Beauties of Science Fiction this week. If you look at our past podcasts, which are all available on YouTube, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, you can view the first three beauties, but they are rather far back there in the line because we've had a lot of interesting sci-fi come across our desks and tables and floors of late, and so it's just been a while since we've revisited the text. So we're going to look at the fourth beauty this week, which is imaginary science. But before we do that, how about that Annihilation trailer?
How about it? It was amazing.
How about it? It's amazing. Okay, so Tony, describe.
It perfectly captured in not even 2 minutes the textual atmosphere of the book in auditory and visual form. Like, it's not even that I was like looking at it and I was like, yeah, that's that. I mean, I was, but more importantly, I was like, wow, somehow in this 2-minute trailer, it is as immersive of a world as the book was. Not to say that it's like, you know, a trailer is equivalent to the book, but just it recreated it so well, and it did it in another medium, and it was one of those things that I did not dare myself to, I did not dare allow myself to hope for, and when I saw it, I was like, excellent.
There's enough differences. We are talking, of course, about the trailer for Annihilation, which is the film adaptation of Jeff Vandermeer's, the first installation of Jeff Vandermeer's Area X trilogy, which is being adapted and will be released, I believe it is February or March next year.
Yep.
Of course, that's next year, so it could change. But
Right.
Early next year, spring 2018, it's going to be a different world from what I had in my head when I was reading the book, but in a good way, I think. There's some really interesting textural things happening. And it comes out, I realized, within a month of A Wrinkle in Time.
Oh, it does? I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And we have some other sci-fi movies coming up next year, which look pretty interesting, including the only Marvel movie that I will go to see next year, which is Black Panther, which looks fascinating. Afrofuturism possibly at its best in terms of what we've seen on screen. And yeah, lots of great stuff happening on the small and big screen in the coming weeks.
We just had the pilot for Star Trek Discovery, which I have seen, but Kendra has not, so lips are zipped.
But tell me what you think. Well, no, not quite zip your lips. Very brief summary. Did you like it?
I was impressed. I was really impressed.
Back to Istvan Csicsery-Ronay and imaginary science.
Yes.
Tony, for those who may not have recently listened to our previous podcasts drawn from this book, what are we doing when we dig into the seven beauties of science fiction?
What are any of us really doing, man? I don't
God.
know. Okay, so no, all right. The seven beauties of science fiction. In a nutshell, Istvan Csicsery-Ronay had this idea. Well, what actually is science fiction? How do we say what science fiction is versus what something else is? And his idea is that works of science fiction tend to show off these seven beauties, these seven different traits. And we've talked through the first three that he lists in his book. The one that we refer to the most often is the Novum, or the central new concept of a particular work of science fiction. But we are going to go on to the fourth one today. I should also say, if you are listening up through this point and you're still not sure if you're going to continue listening, that you don't have to have read this book to listen to it, to understand what we're talking about. We're not responding directly to the book. It's more like we've read the book and are taking examples that we think are particularly pertinent and help us as like science fiction readers and watchers.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. We are inspired by Csicsery-Ronay, but we are not enslaved to the text, for sure. This is not a a critical analysis of Csicsery-Ronay
Yep.
on any level. So the first 3 novums we talked about was Fictive Neology, Fictive Novums, which is perhaps our favorite and so far the most useful
Yes.
in reframing how we understand sci-fi, and also Future History,
Yes.
which was really interesting because it's a forward-thinking, backward-thinking movement, which is, it's really going to mess with your head. But
Yeah.
Imaginary science is on the surface. This is the fourth beauty. Imaginary science is on the surface ultra simple. It's the science which enables sci-fi to keep the sci and tied to the fi. You could not have
to keep the sci tied to the fi. Oh yes.
Oh God, I should apologize in advance. I do not have a brain and I barely have a face, so I'm just going to pretend like I make sense.
What the hell is speaking to me right now? Are you just a mouth atop a neck?
I am born.
Oh, all right.
Isn't that the shape of born?
I'm cool with that. I sort of figured that born looked like a succulent. Anyway.
Succulent with lips.
Yep.
Okay, imaginary science. Is it just science in science fiction? Is it just... Tell me, what do you think of when you think of imaginary science?
Here is the major issue that I have with this chapter. Imaginary science gives you a completely different picture of what he's talking about than my preferred title chapter, which he actually says, the image of science. Mm-hmm. And I think the difference here is that imaginary science, you're it could be anything could be science, all futures could be science. It leads you to that Isaac Asimov quote, anything that's far removed, I'm butchering this quote, but the paraphrase is that, anything looks like magic if it's removed enough from the technology that you're used to. Future tech looks like magic because you don't understand how it works. Which, again, that's by a science fiction author.
You're thinking one of Arthur C. Clarke's 3 laws, aren't you?
No.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic?
Yes. Yes, I am. That's the one. I don't know why I thought it was Asimov. Anyway.
I still love you.
So, thank you. So imaginary science, even though that is right there science fictional precept by a science fiction author, imaginary science just sounds to me like it could be anything. But in the image of science communicates to me, and this obviously could be very different from other people, but that science fiction is trying to work in the image of science, that it's trying to, on whatever level, whether it's really important or really in the background of a particular text, trying to capture that scientific process, that empirical way of thinking, that, that there's something sciencey going on in
There's
there.
There's something sciencey going on.
Yeah.
It's timey-wimey.
It is.
Timey-wimey, whatever.
Yeah.
Bling blong.
Yeah.
I don't even know. I haven't watched Doctor Who in a long time. There's some timey-wimey something.
There is. But does that make sense to you? When I say
it does. It does, and I think it helps. I think it helps to look or reframe imaginary science as in the image of science, because if you think about our long-standing conversation about hard sci-fi versus what else is there than hard science, perhaps what's useful about hard science is that it's a term to describe when the image of science and what we know science to be today are one and the same, or very close to being one and the same. Mm-hmm. So the image is very close to the reality. Mm-hmm. Whereas you can also have the image of science that is a pretty far departure from reality, and I could think of steampunk as a good example. Mm-hmm. It's based on rough scientific principles of steam engines and whatnot.
And also punk from the noted scientists like, Susie and the Banshees.
Yes, definitely. And so the image and the reality there are rather far apart, but that doesn't mean that there isn't science present in steampunk on some level. Yeah. Whether it's background or foregrounded. So I can think of several axes that we could describe science in a science fictional text along, and one is image versus reality, and one is background versus foreground. Because in some texts, you can have a quote-unquote, very massive air quotes here since we kind of hate the term, you could have a quote-unquote hard sci-fi text where the science itself plays a minor background role.
Yes. And
you could theoretically have a quote-unquote soft sci-fi text where the science has a very foregrounded role. So I think you could, play with those axes and come up with a variety of texts that fit each quadrant, which could be interesting. Mm-hmm. If I slept more, I might actually draw that out on paper, but I won't.
My sort of background question for this is, what is science? Like, when we're talking about science fiction, at its core, it seems kind of like we're meaning, in some way, fiction that responds to, uses, or is in the image of science. But when we're saying science, that's such a broad category of things with such a mixed history that it seems like, a lot of the go-to, and we brought this up in our hard science fiction podcast, we talk about it a lot, but the go-to for a lot of science fiction is it has something to do with physics. Or, branching out, it has something to do with, weird alien biologies. And when we start to talk about Novums, to use another Csicsery-Ronay's examples, and, talk about the Novum for Star Trek, for example, which I love coming back to, as, the government, the Federation itself, and therefore, it's more work of social science fiction, because it's using social science, that gets even more pushback, I think. So, this idea of what science actually is, and therefore what science fiction is to be in the image of that thing, is also a really important question, right? Because you're thinking about all of the ways that science can exist and has existed and could possibly exist in the future, and that's no small task if you're a science fiction author to try and visualize what this, institution of knowledge might be way in the future.
Yeah, but I think we might be getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Probably.
Yes. In that if we go back to the first text, which is widely recognized as Western science fiction, we're talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. And in that text, the sci part of the fi is the fact that you have a scientist at the heart of the work, Dr. Frankenstein, who is doing something, quote unquote, air quotes, massive air quotes, science-y with his experiments in a laboratory to do something which otherwise defied the known laws of, science, which is hilarious to me. So it wasn't that the science in Frankenstein was remotely scientific, it was that it had a scientist at the heart of it, I think. And that was pretty innovative. You see scientists start cropping up in all sorts of works afterward and sometimes even before, but that was the first real text that people recognize as science fictional. So perhaps it's not really about the science at all. This is my postulation, but our assumptions about what it means to engage in science, to be a scientist. And so Csicsery-Ronay, one of the few things that he said that I thought made great sense was that science in sci-fi often functions as a source of metaphors, and sometimes otherwise serves to instill the virtues of scientific consciousness. So they might be texts which are intending to raise awareness about some sort of scientific consciousness, which would probably adhere more closely to the air quote hard sci-fi end of the spectrum. Or it might be that it provides another vocabulary, another way of speaking about the universe that happens to appropriate the language of science or the person of the scientist, and therefore become that source of metaphors.
Yes.
I think that you've got several ways that science functions in sci-fi, and maybe we've done the genre a disservice by conflating all of those things into one, or maybe we've done it a service. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I really like the idea of science as a source of metaphors, because what that says to me is that science fiction is trading on this idea that we have, and by we I mean readers of science fiction, are bringing in these notions about what science is and what science does, as well as what science fiction is and what science fiction does. And with every new work of science fiction that we read or watch or whatever, you kind of have to make those two concepts work together, what science is and does and what science fiction is and does. So using science as a source of metaphors is kind of a really interesting lens to look through and view those ideas, because every... Okay, let me think about how that makes sense actually for a minute. Because if we're bringing in this knowledge of, or our particular concepts of what science and science fiction are and do, we have those available to us, those knowledges. God damn it, now I'm just sounding like academic. I like that. I like that a lot. That source of metaphors. I'm gonna think more about this.
Well, and okay, so metaphors only function in literature when enough people understand, like, what you're saying. Metaphors rely on symbolic understanding and all of this,
yes.
Substitutionary understanding. So there's a lot of heavy shit in the Fourth Beauty about how I think it's implicit that the popularity of sci-fi may in fact depend on a more widespread social scientific literacy than used to be present. So we know a lot more on a general social level. We know more techno-scientific language. We know more about how cells and biology and light and gravity waves and such all operate. And because we do, these science fictional metaphors work. This metaphoric operation works, which, okay, so then scientific literacy is in itself dependent on, and this is a quote, state or class management of the means of scientific production, for example, restrictions on lab use, university admissions, and access to scientific research. So basically, can we only understand sci-fi because we have funded science education, because we've made science education accessible? And I'm, rolling my eyes a little bit as I say that, because it's not universally true by any means that it is accessible. But because more of us understand, I mean, does that make sci-fi like a bourgeoisie, like cliquey genre? And how can we stop that and make it better and more accessible to people who don't have access to university laboratories and funding and shit like that,
Well, absolutely is my answer to your question of whether it's cliquey and so forth. But is that due to knowledge restriction? I think it is to some degree, but I also think that, we're not putting science fiction up there with, academic journals. You don't need really a specialized vocabulary to pick up a good work of science fiction and get into it. The same is true for a good work of fiction in any genre, or a good piece of writing, or a good movie, or a good TV show, or whatever. You are taught by the author, by the creator, or whomever is working on it, how to read or view, how to perceive, how to enjoy. And if it does it well, then you like that thing. Are you missing out in terms of some texts that are dealing in hard science? I think that would be yes. And by hard science, I don't just mean physics, chemistry, mathematics. I mean works that take their science very seriously and are trying to,
like Arrival,
air quotes, get it correct. Right, like Arrival. And I think that that's a great example. And if we can go back to the science as a source of metaphors, I think what I was trying to get at, and you articulated a little bit as well, is that both our understanding of science in science fiction and science fiction itself trade on a lot of cultural consciousness. And I think that's what this quote is getting at, really, as well. That when we're looking at science and science fiction, we're maybe bringing up these concepts of like, oh, far future spaceships, they can travel really quickly, but maybe they can't travel faster than light because of relativity. And like, you don't understand, like, I certainly would not understand like any specifics on like the mathematics or physics of relativity, probably, but like I understand that that's an idea that constrains like whether or not objects can travel faster than light, and they can. But you know, the other side of that, which you said was instilling the virtues of scientific consciousness, like at the same time I'm getting those, you know, that rich cultural heritage about faster than light travel and how that's not really possible. That's also engaging with the scientific consciousness. I know, because of my knowledge of science fiction, that objects can't travel faster than light. So I'm becoming more conscious, more fluent in science itself, in our current understanding of science. So it's kind of engaging both of those things. And you said in our document that Csicsery-Ronay kind of sets those up as a versus, a binary, that like its works are either or. And you said, well, maybe this is a spectrum. And I think not only a spectrum, but like something that works of science fiction can tango with all at the same time. Science can be a source of metaphors for science fiction. Science can also instill what it means to be a scientist or think scientifically into a work of science fiction. And all of that can be going on at the same time.
Let's tie this down to some specific texts as examples. So we mentioned Arrival. Mm-hmm. How would Arrival be an example in favor of your argument that this is all not just a spectrum, but more than that? Mm-hmm. What would you say?
Well, I think, let's think about, again, the two ideas, that science is there as a source of metaphors, and science is, in science fiction, to instill the virtues of scientific consciousness. The instilling of the virtues of scientific consciousness is more obvious, I think, both in Arrival and the story that it's based on, the story of your life, because we're behind two characters who are a linguist and a physicist, respectively, who are very intelligent, think about things in a scientific way. There's going to be a lot of like self-referential definitions here. So that there's a lot of installation of scientific consciousness there because we're so close to these characters who are scientists, and they're written really well by Ted Chiang, to the point that you, whether you're watching the movie or reading the story, get a sense of what it would be like to encounter this alien language and try and make sense of communicating with these aliens.
And would you say that holds true for something like the Area X trilogy as well, where you have people who do not have names but have job descriptions that are scientific in nature?
Yeah, that's a good comparison. I would say, I mean, that's an interesting comparison, because I would say similar but not really. And the difference is, I think, more in the atmospheres that the books themselves are creating. The atmosphere in Story of Your Life and Arrival is meant to be this sort of scientific vivisection of the situation that's happening, of the events, of the meetings, of the contacts. Whereas in Area X, there's this really conscious move on the part of both Jeff Vandermeer and within the universe of the book itself to obscure Area X and keep folks who think scientifically, who use science as a way to approach the world, who try and, think about things empirically, to really halt that from happening and show that science is coming up against a wall in a place like Area X. So I think that they're kind of playing with the same things, but those two works are using them in really different ways.
And would you say, as Csicsery-Ronay asserts, that the science of sci-fi must violate known science if it is to be science fictional?
All right. So you said in our notes, really? Double question mark. Violate in bold with double question marks. So I think it's interesting because Csicsery-Ronay using the word violate is
it's so violent.
It's so violent, but it communicates to me that he feels very strongly about this idea that fictional science has to go strongly and perhaps aggressively against the grain of known science in order to be science fictional. And I see that's it's interesting because obviously, and let's take Arrival / Story of Your Life as another example. I'm not a linguist. We have said many times on this podcast that we are not linguists. We don't really know how to think about language in that way. But with that said, seeing the processes that the main character goes through in order to try and understand the alien's language, and that's part of, we find that in the vocabulary she uses, the procedures she goes through, the time it takes her to do it, the many missteps, like all of that lines up with my understanding of the modern scientific process. And the way that she goes about doing it really fits in with what I know of linguistics. Therefore, all of that seems plausible. But the science fictional part of it, the part that violates known science, to use Csicsery-Ronay's phrase, is the fact that we're doing this with aliens, that it's a language that has never been spoken with a human mouth, that has never been processed through a human brain, that isn't the sort of social fabric that underlies interactions between different humans. Therefore, can we take the science of linguistics and what we know about it and apply it to the same situation? And that seems like the argument that he's making. That's the science fictional part of it. If it was, folks just trying to understand another human language, that would be scientific literature. That wouldn't be science fictional. But because we're violating...
but it would be fiction.
It would be fiction, right. If it was... It would be
sciencey.
It would be sciencey. So why wouldn't that be science fiction? Actually, now that I use that example, what separates, say there's a piece of fiction, really well-researched linguistic fiction, again, from the perspective, whether first person, third person, whatever, but a linguist who goes about her science very rigorously, meets a group of indigenous peoples in a place no one speaks their language. She goes about trying to figure out how to communicate with them. Would that be a piece of science fiction in the same way that Story of Your Life or Arrival is a piece of science fiction? According to Csicsery-Ronay.
Question mark.
Yeah.
Because I think that it could be. I think that given that we've spent 33 prior episodes exploding out our definition of what qualifies as sci-fi, I think that has given us a broader perspective on what can qualify. And I think depending on what else happens in that text, it totally could be science fictional.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people might frame it or sell it as historical fiction or just literary fiction or whatnot, but we have picked fights with those categories as well in the past. So I kind of want to get back to, as we always do, it seems like when we talk about Csicsery-Ronay, to fighting with and tangling with this definition of what gets to qualify as sci-fi.
Yes.
And are we just being pompous jackasses by saying that you qualify and you qualify and you get to pass the pearly gates of sci-fi heaven, but no, you go down to the dungeons of mass, romance or whatever.
Right.
Basically, I like when we see this definition as messy and deeply problematic and impossible to enforce or police. So I think Csicsery-Ronay might be trying a little too hard, in my opinion, to hold together some sort of coherent understanding of what counts as sci-fi. And perhaps you have to do that in order to write a book of critical analysis of a genre. I don't know. I've never done that, so I'm criticizing without any understanding of how it works.
Right, and it's interesting because at the time that I read this book, which was about a year ago, I was reading other critical books. What's the word I'm looking for? Like critical analyses of science fiction. And, as much as we're representing Csicsery-Ronay's book as kind of like, I don't want to say stodgy, but it has these definitions. It's trying to decide what science fiction.
It's actually
really great. Like there's so many other books that are very clearly like science fiction is this and this and this, and if it isn't these three things, it is not science fiction. And he's so open about it compared to other things, and I find it really lovely, actually, that he has these, you know, these definitions that aren't really definitions, but are more just kind of like descriptions of all of this great fictional work out there that could be described as science fictional or not, depending upon what.
Yeah. I really wish I could just like sit the dude down and give him a beer, because we've spent 4 episodes tearing his book to bits when we actually really like it.
Yeah.
Which, you know, that feels like the worst kind of condolence that you could give an author.
Right.
Oh, I actually really liked it, but sorry about that review.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes.
I will say, though, I find it fascinating all of the texts that he references in this particular chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And he references Jules Verne,
Mm-hmm.
H.G. Wells,
Mm-hmm.
Gwyneth Jones,
Mm-hmm.
C.S. Lewis, the Incal, which I had to look that one up, and I'm going to try and get it through the library because it sounds weird. He does spend some time quoting Tatiana Chernyshova, and she's a more contemporary critic of science fiction, I guess. But he also quotes Thomas More and Kafka and William Defoe and Jonathan Swift and Edgar Allan Poe and Fred Hoyle and Greg Bear. And he makes some allusions to quite a few other authors. But there's so many Golden Age sci-fi authors, or even pre-Golden Age sci-fi authors that rate his list. And I appreciated that he brought in Chernyshova as a commentator, because she's really one of the few female voices in this chapter. And so having the modern female voice commenting on these Golden Age sci-fi authors was really interesting. But I wanted to hear what you thought. As you're reading this chapter, what does it do to our ability to create definitions, enforce definitions, explode definitions, to focus so heavily on a certain era and a certain region even of science fiction authors? Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna, to answer that, I want to actually take it back to Frankenstein again, and what you said about, you know, the central character of Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, is a scientist. And I agree with you on that, but I wanted to add in, and I think this is actually an excellent place to do so, because it'll be a good segue. I talk about what I'm going to do when I say things.
Segue!
But you know, not only does it have that going for it, it has this kind of idea that the body and the brain are stimulated by electricity. If you can just put enough electricity into a body that contains a brain, and you've made that body, like, it can get going again. And obviously now it seems like super outdated, and we know much more about how the brain works, kind of, and how bodies work, also kind of. And, you know, but you know, trying to put myself in that context, not only around when the book was written, but also like where science was and what, you know, science fiction might have been at the beginning. I think that what Frankenstein did in the time is very similar to, you know, the imaginary science we're kind of talking about with works like Annihilation and Arrival now. Like, contextually, they're actually very similar. So, you know, and to do that for some of the books on this list, I think it's also possible to take this particular list that he has given us in the chapter, look at these works, and synthesize some of the things that he synthesized. But, you know, and I'm trying to be very fair with those statements, but me looking at this list right now, I'm like, that list is hella boring. Like, the things on my personal reading list from the past, like, 4 months are all books from 2017. I'm really trying to, like, get caught up with books that have come out and are coming out this year. So that's usually not true. I usually tend to, you know, read further afield in time than that. You know, there's a fair bit of books that have been published in the last several decades, in the last several years, in the last year. And so, anyway, my point is that if, say, I was to substitute his list of books in this chapter with my list of books that I've read in the past several months, would it hold up? Could you come to the same conclusions? Or if I was to give him this list, could he come to the same conclusions based upon this list of really, really contemporary works? And I don't know that he could, or I could, or anyone could, because things change so rapidly that, and I think that's part of his point in this book with these, not quite definitions, but do they change so rapidly that his statements about, like, the science in science fiction needs to violate known science if it's going to be science fictional, or science is a source of metaphors versus instilling the virtues of scientific consciousness, or being in the image of science. Like, do those things hold for the modern science fiction that's coming out today? In other words, is the way that he's thinking about science fiction in this work, is it useful because it's descriptive of science fiction of the past, present, and future, or is it too restrictive because it's prescribing what science fiction should be?
And I think he really is trying to provide a texture and a background for a wider understanding of sci-fi. I don't think he's trying to be prescriptive.
No, I don't think so either.
But I do think that anytime you write a several hundred page book on what a genre is or isn't, you're going to end up with some posturing that, and maybe this is just the academic voice, which there's a reason why I'm not working in academia right now, and that's because I spent 4 years, 5 years, kind of trying to figure out how to navigate the academic voice and never quite feeling comfortable with it.
Right.
But I think he's trying to do a good thing. I think he gets most of the way there. And I do enjoy reading the Seven Beauties of Science Fiction because even when I'm most conflicted and most arguing with it, I'm very well aware that I would never have come up with my brilliant insights, my brilliant, witty counter-arguments, had he not postulated the postulations that he postulates,
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And I have to say, I know that probably not everyone is going to want to run out and grab a copy of this book and read it after we've been talking about it, but it is actually pretty readable for a book that's, I think, primarily meant for other folks who are, in academia, particularly in literature and language, and are trying to think about some of these things. But for that, it's very readable. But obviously, we as kind of like, I am in academia, but I'm not in that particular area of academia. So it's difficult for me. This is going to sound terrible, but like I like some of it and I pull some of it, but it's hard for me to like sustain caring in a lot of like the minutia of some of his arguments and the way that he phrases some of the arguments. But anyway, I swore when we started that this podcast was not going to be just about the book, and so I want to skew us away from that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, because we've got not a huge amount of time before we need to wrap up this podcast.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of our favorite works of science fiction and maybe how they built our understanding of what is science-y about sci-fi.
Good. Yeah. Right.
So I'm going to let you come up with one because I've thrown a couple texts your way already.
You have. I'm going to go back to Star Trek again. Because when I was a kid, like, growing up watching Next Generation, like graduating Deep Space Nine and Voyager in the 90s, what science fiction was to me was Star Trek until I started to go further afield. And so science fiction then was that, you had things like the warp drive and the transporters and the replicators and this kind of like magic technology. But you also had this Starfleet ideal of exploration, which was, seeking out new worlds and new civilizations that we want to, episodes tended to start, especially Next Generation, with like, we are categorizing this nebula, or we're observing this pulsar, or we're doing a field study on this planet or something. And that sort of, to me...
Especially the Next Generation.
Yeah, especially the Next Generation. That, in me, instilled this, like, this is what science fiction is, because here are people exploring, doing science, seeing new things. And so science was always kind of this romantic proposition of, this explorer age of Starfleet in the far future, where humans have gotten to a point where this desire to explore and to know more for the sake of knowing is, kind of our purpose. And unfortunately, then I grew up in the real world and things were very sad. But, and since then, as a grown-up and making the argument about Star Trek's Novum and the government and politics. Yeah, kind of sometimes. But, I can make that argument as well. But really, like, Star Trek was the thing that showed me what imaginary science was in the beginning. And then, since then, other works have really had to build on, push against, jump off of that initial understanding of what science fiction looked like.
Well, I think maybe this actually ties back to my argument that maybe what's sciencey about sci-fi is the scientists in the text.
Right.
Whether or not they're called scientists. But you're talking about the primary attraction of Star Trek being the mindset of these scientists as they go forth and do their science.
Yes.
And I think that that's fascinating, and I happen to agree that that's what I find most interesting about science fiction as well. Mm-hmm. Whether or not I'm talking about Star Trek or Star Wars, honestly, that's what distinguishes for me the difference between the two. They're often pitted against each other, but for me, the attraction of Star Trek is the scientists. Yeah. The attraction of Star Wars is the cool gadgets and again, the people, the relationships between the people. Right. But I have to admit that very few of them espouse something remotely scientific in their worldview or interests or passions or pursuits. Yeah. So what you're left with is an action story that happens in a cool, shiny future or past. Yeah. Past.
Well, okay, so here's another example that I think would be worth talking about as we get to the end of the podcast. And I want to toss this one to you, actually. But Margaret Atwood is someone who has roundly rejected the label of science fiction time and again for her various works. And I want to think specifically of Orcs and Crake and its sequels. How do you think that under this idea of imaginary science, how would that or wouldn't that work as science fiction?
Okay, so Orcs and Crake, I happen to have listened to way too many podcasts about this series. And I've also read quite a few articles about it. And I may be at the point where I know too much about the way it was made in order to step back and kind of remember what it felt like to read it for the first time. I have only read the first book in the trilogy. I own the second one. I purchased it recently. It's just, I enjoyed it so much, I almost didn't want to read a sequel because I liked where the first book left off.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway. But back to the text itself, Margaret Atwood's gone on record so many times to say, I don't see this as prescient because I deliberately went about my writing process, and this is very loosely paraphrased, but I went about my writing process drawing upon sciences that already existed. Mm-hmm. So it's not science fictional in the sense that it's using unknown or new or transgressive sciences, things that don't exist yet. And in a sense, Star Trek, the replicator or the tea making machine, whatever it's called, those things have actually been created now, but a lot of the people who were responsible for them cite Star Trek as an inspiration for having the idea in the first place. Right. Which is like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. Mm-hmm. But Margaret Atwood was going at it differently. She said, these already exist. I am going to incorporate them, and what's going to be perhaps disjointing or affecting about the book is the way that people employ them in ways that they have always employed them, but rendering it perhaps more horrific or ratcheting up the extreme nature of this technological employment. So the CRISPR process for editing genes was more or less invented around the same time that she was writing Oryx and Crake. And she talks a lot about how her world and CRISPR are and are not related. This is a very clunky way of me getting at this answer, but I don't even quite know.
Well, I think,
Yeah.
I think that part of the reason that this is difficult is that this is the same question as my hypothetical, like, say you have a story about a linguist who's going to meet with some indigenous folks whose language no one really knows outside of those indigenous people who speak it. Like, that's the same sort of idea as, what it feels like Margaret Atwood is going for in Orcs and Crake. That idea of being sciencey but not really using any new science or not pushing science into its violation or its transgression.
Well, and again, the primary relationship at the heart of the text is between a non-scientist and the scientist and the subject of the experiment, in a sense. Like, there's 3 primary characters, and they are united by the scientist's desire to carry out his experiment to the utmost. And so, again, like, the fascination isn't with specific elements of the science as described in the text. It's between the people. It's with the people themselves and with the scientists. Why is he doing what he's doing?
Yeah.
Is it right? Is it good?
Yes.
What does it mean to be right and good in science?
Yeah.
Deep questions. And I would say, here's a text that we haven't talked about a million times on the podcast, but one that I deeply, deeply enjoy. And it was Carolyn Ives Gilman's Dark Orbit, which is about first contact, in a sense. It's, they're exploring a strange new planet. And you have an exoethnologist at the center of the text. And you have another central female character. And the pleasure of the book is watching the characters interact. Again, so is science, like accurate science, vital to science fiction? No.
No.
Maybe not. But the scientists, maybe.
Yeah.
Question mark.
That's interesting. And it's an interesting place to land after, we started with imaginary science or being in the image of science and how that's integral to science fiction, or, is that integral? And maybe ending with, well, maybe the image of science itself is not so integral, but the scientist or someone in the image of the scientist, maybe that's what helps transform a text into a science fictional text.
We'll have to zoom out and reframe a little bit and maybe get at this in another podcast.
Yeah.
Because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about the scientist in sci-fi yet. So
no, we haven't.
Maybe that's a subject for future podcasts.
I think that's a great subject for a future podcast.
Well, on that note, I guess it's time to wrap up. We are at 50 minutes. So, Tony,
yes,
where can you find us if you have further thoughts about the scientist or the science at the heart of sci-fi?
You can find us in that bag of gray aliens we know you're keeping in your basement. So just FYI, we are aware of those.
And we've already reported you.
We've already reported you to Scully, because she's the one who's going to get things done. You know it.
Boom!
Boom! So, where you can find us on the internet,
You
can listen to us wherever you download your podcasts, iTunes, podcast app, SoundCloud. All of our back episodes are available on YouTube. Just search for The Imaginaries. You can also check out our new improved webpage at imaginaries.net. Kendra has just put in a whole lot of work to give it a good overhaul and make it look really interesting. We now have stuff on there like what we're reading, so you can know what to expect next in the podcast. You can see more about the authors and the books that we tend to talk about a lot if you want to learn. And of course, you can see links to all of our podcasts, what we've been talking about recently, and where and how to listen to them. And then, of course, we're on Twitter, and we tweet, well, Kendra tweets with our account.
Not always.
Fairly regularly, but that's imaginary_pod, and from that you can get to both of our personal Twitters as well.
Yes, we do tweet. We have the tweets.
Yep.
So, we also did have a great recommendation come in over Twitter in the last week, and that was for China Mieville's Embassy Town, where we've talked about Perdido Street Station before. And I have yet to read China Mieville and was resistant to it because you had said it's kind of, maybe, maybe not. So I'm going to go ahead and put Embassy Town on the list of things that I want to read in the near future. And we'll talk about that when I get through some of my grad coursework.
Right.
What else are you reading? What can we look forward to hearing about from you in the future?
I just finished Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin, the third in her Broken Earth trilogy. I'm currently reading The Wanderers by Meg Howry. Recently, I've read Taste of Marrow by Sarah Gailey. I have also just read Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shannon McGuire, all of which have come out within the last month or two, so I was trying to catch up on some of those series. So you can definitely expect us to talk more about all of those ongoing series in the future, I am sure.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Well, thank you, Tony, so much for recording yet another fantastic podcast. And those of you guys who are
for talking and putting together such great notes. Kendra actually did pretty much single-handedly the notes for this episode, so all of these great thoughts were hers, all of them meanderings were mine.
Single one.
And of course, thank you to our listeners, like you were about to say, for actually listening and bearing with us for 50 minutes through this another chapter of the 7 Beauties of Science Fiction.
Yeah, we'll get to the 5th one eventually, but if you look at the pattern of our past history, it might be a while before we get back to
it. May
5.
be, yes.
It may be. But thank you guys so much, and we will catch you in a couple of weeks.
Bye.
Bye.